Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. I'm Chris Salvino. I'm the CEO of Lunar Helium-3 Mining, and I want to welcome you all to this great presentation. I want to thank Jack, Kevin, Gary, Todd, Stefan, and Brent for joining us today as we explore this interesting topic. I'm assuming everybody could see my slides. I'm going to do a brief little introduction before I turn over to Brent to moderate. So the topic today is going to be USA versus China. Is there a race? And if so, is it for a flag or a resource? A very timely topic. Our series is this series that we have explores many different topics related to helium-3. It explores the different implication of helium-3. And overall, this series as a whole is asking whether helium-3 enables a true moon-Earth industry, similar to what happened to Earth-based satellites. If you're interested in seeing the past topics, you can go to our website. They're all taped and up there, and they're also on YouTube. You can see the topics from December, January, February, all the way through April. And as a hint, coming up, we will be exploring the rationale for a permanent lunar base. After that, we will be looking at a very timely new topic, decentralized diffusion. Can this power data centers on Earth and in space? Lunar power, and some other exciting topics going into the fall. The level set, because many people on here know what helium-3 is, but many don't. So the next couple of slides are going to be for basically everyone. Helium-3 is a very special isotope of helium. It has very special use cases on Earth. On Earth, we have a small supply as a byproduct of the decay of nuclear weapons production, mainly from the Cold War era. It cannot be manufactured at scale. And the estimated US supply is probably less than 5 kilos. It's almost exhausted. However, the good news is helium-3 comes from the sun. It travels in the solar wind. On Earth, it gets captured by our atmosphere, so we have very little that has reached the ground from space. But on the moon, the great news is there's no atmosphere. It's been baked into the lunar regolith over billions of years. It's estimated to be 1 to 15 parts per billion in lunar soil based on Apollo data sets. I actually believe this number is higher, but that's a topic for another day. And the total estimated supply on the lunar surface, there's a wild estimate of 1 million tons based on the Apollo data set. This could be higher or smaller, but it's a lot of it. Well, who cares about helium-3? It has some uses, and these are going to be discussed in future live series, plus the ones we've held. So there are existing use cases of helium-3 now. The most important is for border detection and for looking for nuclear bombs. In the future, the large volume supply of helium-3 will go towards nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion, when it uses helium-3, will be the world's first and only true global green energy source. However, in the underlying spot right there, I underlined it for a reason. We believe nuclear fusion can be decentralized if helium-3 is used, not tritium. You can imagine potentially what can happen with decentralized fusion. It could power data centers, answer some of the issues we've been talking about, data centers, power small towns, homes. And one fusion company has actually shown a picture of a DeLorean car, not as a joke, but as the future of potential transportation. The other use for helium-3 is for quantum computing, not as a fuel, but it's the only way to cool quantum computing down to the point of ultra high speed computation, which is very important in national security. Helium-3 is economically different from anything else on the moon. There's no other resource on the moon that makes sense to go obtain to bring back for Earth as a primary economic source. The current price of helium-3 is about $30,000 per gram, plus or minus. If nuclear fusion was adopted across the globe and it was powered by helium-3 only, the total addressable market is about 570 metric tons. That's about $17 trillion worth of revenue, and you can see how that could build out a cis lunar economy. So why start here? For more than 60 years, the moon's been a cost center from Apollo to Artemis. It served a purpose which is great when it comes to public research, prestige, those sorts of things. The sustained activity to date has been relied on government funding, not on revenue. And again, as I mentioned, helium-3 appears to be the only resource that has a plausible chance of having a positive return on investment for investors and to tell a story about green energy. Our company's sole focus is on lunar helium-3 mining. There's other companies focusing on helium-3 in other countries, including China and India. Our questions about helium-3 span space, energy, and economics. And this series attempts to explore these questions publicly and not as a commercial for the company. So this month's topic is USA versus China. Is there a race for a flag or resource? The assumptions for this discussion should be that lunar helium-3 can be technically mined. We've explored some other topics related to the legal aspects of doing this, political, and use cases. So the focus today should be, is there a race between China and the USA? And what is the goal of each country? Are they the same? Maybe they're different. Is this political prestige versus a resource? And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Brent, our moderator, and call the panel up. So we'll try to get the panel up here. Brent, welcome this morning. You're on mute, by the way.
There we go. Thanks a lot, Chris. Appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for joining us this morning. Thanks to all of our panelists for being here. I see everybody's popping on, coming online. I thought we would maybe start with kind of a rapid fire, just list. I'll go person by person. We'll just do a quick kind of yes or no, and then we'll dive into the meat of it. But I guess the idea, the name of the session today is the race for a flag or a resource. So, Todd, you're right next to me. The way my screen is configured, so I'll start with you. Do you think, is there a race, and is it primarily between China and the United States?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is a race, and I think it is much more than just planting flags on the surface like before. It's not just about getting to the finish line. I mean, that certainly is part of the competition, no doubt. But I think that this is a race about resources. I think it is even more broadly a race about who is going to set the terms of how the lunar economy and the deep space economy will work into the future. And I think there's no doubt the two main players in this race are the United States and China. And we are each bringing coalitions of nations along with us as part of that. So another aspect of the race is who can bring the biggest and the most enduring coalition of nations with them.
Yeah, and so with that, I'm going to go right over to Jerry this morning. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. You're actually in India today, right? Correct?
Yes.
So I know there's a time difference for sure. So we really appreciate you being here. So that being said, you kind of heard what Todd mentioned. Would you agree? Is there a space race? Does it primarily involve the United States and China? And maybe you could shed a little bit of light on where India factors into all of that.
Oh yeah, here in India, we do feel that there is a race because we get pulled by both the factions often. We are part of the Artemis Accords, and in other groupings, especially the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS groupings, we do discuss a lot of astronomy and space exploration as a means of scientific diplomacy. But
Mhm,
beyond the fact that we do not have much of interactions with the Chinese space program, it has been very minimal. But with the United States, it's quite obvious that since 2005, the year
mhm,
we signed the US-India Civil Space Cooperation, we have been really going great guns in lunar cooperation. And some of our biggest lunar missions have had, humongous participation and support coming from the US national labs, from universities, as well as, of course, NASA. So we do feel that there is a race. We are not part of that race primarily because we have our own program to run,
mhm,
and that program is progressing at a slow but steady pace.
mhm. Okay, thank you for that. And we'll be circling back to you for more input as well. Stephen, good morning. How are you? Let's get your
I'm
thoughts.
great. Thank you for having me. My thoughts to the questions you outlined above are yes, the United States is in a space race, mostly because the U.S. Congress says it's in a space race. Um, and I believe that China is the main competitor again because the powers that be say that China is the main opponent aside from the technological feats. And we'll probably dip our toe into this pool in just a moment, on the balance of the question, is this about flags or resources? A lot of people draw the distinction between the first space race and the space race we're experiencing now, as the difference being back then it was about prestige and now it's about resources. I would complicate that a little bit. I think it's a lot more about resources than it was in 1969, the entire decade of the 60s. But let's not pretend that it's not about prestige at all. The last time we went to the moon was 1972, aside from the Artemis 2 mission, of course. And I think we need to prove these systems again. We need to prove the viability again. And I would say on the balance, maybe 20% prestige, 80% resources. But I'll
Mhm.
return to that in a minute.
Okay, yeah, and we definitely will dive into that some more. Moving right along the line for me this morning, let's talk to Kevin. Good morning. Thanks for being with us again today and get your thoughts.
Morning. Happy to be here. Just wanted to say first, as a Department of War employee, that the views that I expressed today are purely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of War, the U.S. Air Force, or Air University. With that, yeah, I think we are in a race. I have to violently agree with my co-panelist here. But I think it differs in a couple of ways, at least, from the space race that we had with the Soviet Union during the 1960s. One, I think, is that it is, as Stephen was saying, it is much more broad based. So when China talks about its space program, it talks about not only resource development, but also using space to benefit or advantage China across the realm of
Mhm.
national power. So we're talking about how space can help out China diplomatically, prestige, reputationally, militarily, and economic. I think another major difference is that this is not a short-term race. China
Mhm.
is not specifically pegging its progress in space technologies to what the US is doing. So, for example, the US stated in 2019 that we wanted to go back to the moon in 2024, right? It wasn't until 2023, right, that China stated that it was going to go back to the moon by 2030. And now NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman has stated that we can expect a lunar flyby by the Chinese in 2027. But I think the most important date is really 2049. And by then, what we hear Chinese analysts talk about is that they want to transition from being a major space power to a strong space power. And they define that by either being the equal of the United States or surpassing the United States in space technologies.
Thank you for that. And Jack, saving the best for last. Again, thank you for joining us. And what are your thoughts on, is this a race? Is it flag? Is it for resources? And is it the United States against China?
I think it's all of the above, and everybody's really contributed some great thoughts to this topic. But bear in mind that China is in a number of different races besides just a space race. They're in an AI race, they're in a trade race, they're in a political race, they're a military race, and so forth. So a lot of their efforts are conjoined. And the fact that we're talking about the space race is just kind of pulling one of those topics out of the basket of issues that they're competing on. And I'd like to focus on the word competing as opposed to or competition as opposed to a space race. I think the whole idea of competing, by the way, is beneficial to the process of establishing human presence on the moon and throughout the solar system and so forth. So I think that generates a lot more technology, a lot more knowledge out of the process. So I look at the space race, or whatever you want to call it, as a good thing, as a beneficial thing to that
Mhm.
process.
Let me do kind of a follow-up with all of that in mind. It seems like everybody agrees that it's some sort of a race going on. Um, Stephen, you mentioned kind of the last time you went in the 60s, and I was alive. I was a kid back then. As just a kid, not knowing all the politics and the science and everything, I clearly understood that there was a race and that it was us against the Russians. And there was, I remember that there was even coverage so that we would see things like, well, the Russians did this. It kind of looks like maybe they're in the lead. Oh no, now we've done this and we're in the lead. So there was this thing. When I talk to people today about where we currently are, some people didn't know we're actually sending a rocket with astronauts back. I had literal discussions in an editorial meeting with a major broadcast entity where they said, well, if this was such a big deal, how come China and India aren't doing it? And I'm like, well, they are. But the point being is that in 69, we knew who our competition was. We monitored them. What they were doing was published. And now people don't even know what the other guys are up to. Can you, and I'll ask any of the panel can chime in on this, but I'm going to kind of start with Stephen. That might be a little bit more in your bailiwick, that it's different this time around. If there's a race, people might not know that there's one running and who's in it.
Yeah, let me draw the distinction using Sputnik. So
Yeah,
Sputnik was
yeah.
such a big deal to Americans in 1957, not because of the beep, beep, beep emanating from the satellite, but because of the R-7 rocket that had propelled the satellite into orbit. It
Mhm.
reflected a new capacity on the behalf of the Soviet military to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile. Up until that time, the
Right.
United States enjoyed two oceanic buffer zones that were eliminated seemingly overnight in
Mhm.
August 57 when the Soviets first tested the missile, and then in October when they launched a satellite into orbit. The satellite itself was a relatively benign artifact. It didn't actually serve a technological function other than basic communication, and even then on a very rudimentary level. It was the rocket that scared the devils out of the Americans and propelled them into a bona fide space program. Today, I think the idea is this is that the reason it hasn't got as much cachet as it did in the 60s is because we've done it already, or at least that's the public framing around the new space race. A couple weeks ago, I published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal warning that China could win the new space race because there was a sense of complacency around the timeline. There had been a bunch of setbacks, technical setbacks, helium leaks, and so on. And the comments at the end of the article from the public were, been there, done that. We don't need to be going back to the moon. So there is a pervasive sense of been there, done that already. There's no prestige reason to go back to the moon. I don't think there's been enough
Right.
public awareness about it's not about prestige anymore. It's about a lot more. I'll turn it over to others who have ideas on this.
Yeah. Jack, do you have thoughts? I know that
Yeah.
it's in particular when it comes to China that you've got some insight and perspective on that.
Well, I think that Stephen's right on the money with that. I mean, one of the issues that we've had a great opportunity that's been passed is to, over time, to answer the what's in it for me question
Hmm.
for constituents and for legislators and so forth. We've that opportunity is still there, but we had a long time to capitalize on that, and we really haven't defined what's in it for me for the average person. And if that value proposition were more clearly defined, I think that the people that Stephen's talking about who responded to his op-ed wouldn't have been so vociferous about saying we've been there, done that. I think that they'd have a clearer understanding of why we're in this process of trying to get to the moon. I'm avoiding the word race. I just, I think of it as a competition more than a race, but and a process, right? So I think that really needs to be done. And I'm kind of curious, how people are defining the what's in it for me kind of proposition on a
Hmm.
number of different levels. Certainly, if you're an investor, you have an idea what's in it for me. If you're an entrepreneur in the space industry, you have an idea. But how about the average person, the average
Hmm.
individual who says, well, gee, how do I get something good out of this whole process?
Right, right. You know what? I want to loop in Kevin and get your perspective because I think one of the notions that we're talking about here is like as Jack coins it, what's in it for me? Does China have that perspective? I mean, I'm guessing that maybe they don't care that their leadership knows what they want to do, and we don't care whether the average public or anything, and maybe business, whether they have a what's in it for me attitude. I could be wrong. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. So China, of course, is not a democracy, so it's a little bit harder to gauge public opinion in China.
Hmm.
Anecdotal evidence would suggest that the average Chinese person has the same type of concerns about space programs that U.S. citizens have been. The sort of rockets versus butter debate, if I can paraphrase. Are is China spending too much money on high technology programs and not enough on social welfare programs? But having said that, they are led by a more authoritarian government, right? And so, and that government tends to take a longer term view of China's development.
Hmm.
And it's less immune to the political pressures of the ordinary Chinese citizen. But
Hmm.
overall, when China sees that it has sending astronauts into space or sending rovers to the moon, this makes China, the average Chinese citizen, very proud. And we got to remember that it wasn't that long ago that China was still very much a developing country. It's really only been in the past 30, 40 years where China's come along. So they've seen some great progress there. They tend to benefit from many of the things that the Chinese Communist Party has done.
Right. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of the focus factor, and the reason for going. So, um, does the United States have a focused reason for going? Or are we divided on that? I mean, I've heard things of we need to go explore and see if we can find water in crystals and things. Obviously, we can talk about helium-3. Some people are saying, do we need to have a permanent established base? Um, and the United States is sorting through why are we going? I think the premise of this discussion is it for prestige and PR, planting a flag, or actually for resources? So, do we have a very clear mission? Are we unified in why we're going? And then conversely, where does China stack up into that? Or do they have a very focused long-term plan? And I'm going to leave it up to whoever wants to raise their hand first on that one. Or else I'll
Yeah,
pick
Uh,
on
I
someone.
can
I was
jump
going
in
to go
here
to
a
you,
bit.
Todd. I really was. Honestly, I was.
Yeah, no, I don't know that we have actually, as a nation, as United States, and as our Artemis coalition, I don't know that we have actually solidified on a coherent message, a coherent
Hmm.
reason yet, and that is a big problem.
Yes.
I can tell you, I think the reason should be the long-term economic potential of operations on
Right.
the lunar surface. That's why we should be going there, and it's resource utilization. And it is, the fundamental, basic science and research to figure out what is there that's worth, utilizing and how do we do it. That is where the government needs to play an important role of leading and kind of pushing the
Hmm.
frontier of our technical and scientific understanding and ability so that industry can then come in and capitalize on that later. Maybe what should, motivate us all to take lunar exploration more seriously now is honestly very similar to what motivated us in the first space race. It's a fear of missing out. So not only did the Soviets surprise us with the Sputnik launch, and there were the military implications that meant that their rocket programs or missile programs were much more advanced than we may have thought. But also throughout the early 60s, the Soviets kept achieving first in space before us. We kept
Right.
losing, right? Not only was it the first satellite, it was the first astronaut, the first human orbiting the Earth. the first spacewalk, the first woman in space. I mean, it was just a list of firsts that the Soviets kept beating us to, and we were trying to catch up. It wasn't until we moved the goal line so far ahead to be putting humans on the moon that we actually had a
Mhm.
chance of catching up.
Right,
So
right.
I think that there was a fear of falling behind, a fear of missing out. And there really should be a similar motivation here, but it's much more economic. There should be a fear of maybe we're going to miss out, and maybe the Chinese are actually going to get there and not just be ahead of us, but set the precedent for how this lunar economy is going to operate in the future in
Right.
terms of property rights, how you can utilize resources, how you can say, what mining fields are yours versus someone else's. There's a lot that is not defined. There's not good international law here yet. Treaties don't really cover a lot of the stuff we're talking about. It wasn't envisioned before. So whoever gets there first is going to be in a unique position of setting precedent, and everyone else that follows is going to be challenging that precedent.
I was going to ask you this in a little bit, but since you brought it up, let's talk about it right now. And that's that idea of the treaties. And there are treaties. Jiri, you mentioned it as well. Some countries are involved in that, and they agree to and abide by the treaty. I don't know if China's one of those countries. I don't know that they are. So then, do they play by the same rules? If whoever gets there first, do they get to dictate, well, this is how things go. This is how we view resources to be shared on the moon. How do we determine that?
Yeah,
Stephen,
I
yeah,
mean,
go. Oh, sorry, Todd. I didn't mean to cut you off. I think you have knowledge, but I did see Stephen raise his hand there for a sec. Let's go, Stephen,
go
and then
ahead.
back to Todd.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to comment, China and the United States are both signatories to the Outer Space Treaty, but a very important point about the Outer Space Treaty is it's completely agnostic on the question of space resources. So, the Artemis Accords explicitly encourage and verify the legality of the extraction and utilization of lunar resources and space resources generally. Because of the US China space race and because of the 2011 Wolf Amendment, China and the United States are not allowed to cooperate on space activity. NASA is not allowed to cooperate with Chinese companies or the Chinese government in space. For that reason, China has set up its own uh, lunar exploration program with the Russians, who are also not members of the Artemis Accords. The Artemis Accords have upwards of 70 signatories at this point, and they all agree as to the legality of the extraction of space resources by signing the Artemis Accords. But that's the basic tension is, will the Artemis Accords come into conflict with some Chinese interpretation of the legality of the extraction of space resources? There's a key phrase in the Artemis Accords that states that operations on the moon will enjoy a safety zone whereby a country will be able to restrict access on the basis of safety until the operations of that space are completed. Now, again, the Chinese government has been more or less quiet on the issue, but there have been a lot of public comment, including Chinese media, that equate safety zones with spheres of influence. There's been a few articles written comparing the safety zones to the enclosure movement of the 18th century in Britain, whereby the common land pasture grounds were closed off to private estates. So there is a lot of conflict, ideological and intellectual conflict between the Chinese and the Americans over the issue of space resources. So Todd's exactly right. There is a legal question that has to be resolved in part by technological accomplishments as to who gets there first, to put it in a blunt way.
Yeah, just to footnote to that, it's not clear to me that there's any provision for sanctions for violating any of these things. So if somebody does something that's a counter to these agreements and accords and so forth, the Chinese may say, well, so what? What are you going to do about it? But I don't. So there's a lot of independence that's potential in operating in space. Another differentiation I just wanted to point out as a small point is we're talking China versus the US, but the US is moving more and more, as everybody knows, to a more commercial approach to space as opposed to a governmental approach to space. And so I'm not sure if we're totally comparing the two equally. And I'm wondering how other people feel about that.
Well, if I could jump in, I think that's exactly one of the issues that's we're going to face on the moon is that China is operating from the standpoint of a state-run or state-run industry, everything going through the state, through the government. And so I think they view property rights as inherently government property rights, whereas we don't view it that way. But I mean, to make this more kind of concrete, the Outer Space Treaty clearly says you can't claim territory on the moon. Jack is exactly right. What's the punishment if you do? But you don't even have to overtly say, I'm claiming this territory. What if you put down an object and say, that's my piece of equipment, and I therefore declare a safety zone around this of, 100 kilometers radius, and that just so happens to be near a very rich deposit of helium-3 or something else, right? We should expect that we're going to find some, deposits that are more rich in things than other places, right? So, you find a very lucrative place, you put an object down, you say, oh, safety zone. Are you not effectively claiming territory? How are we going to adjudicate that? And then what if you've got U.S. commercial operators who are mining resources and, one day, Chinese come up and just say, thank you very much. I'm going to take that because you don't have property rights because you're not a government. Right? These are the kind of things that need to get worked out, and we will be in a much better position if we are the ones there at the beginning setting the precedent of this is how it works. I'd rather be the one setting the precedent than the one challenging it, saying, no, 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 that, I don't like the status quo. I want to do it different. Well, too late.
Right. And what court would have standing to adjudicate all that, right?
Kevin, I see you've got a thought. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So, you know, lunar resource utilization has been a central part of China's lunar exploration program since the very beginning. There is a scientist by the name of Ouyang Ziyuan who, in the 1990s, he's a geologist. He was promoting lunar exploration as the main reason why China should go to the moon. He is now the chief scientist for China's lunar exploration program. So that's always been a motivating, driving force for why China wants to go to the moon. And we are seeing that play out in China's long range plans for lunar exploration. So we say they want to have send an astronaut to the moon by 2030. In the 2030s, they want to set up some sort of smaller lunar base. Begin exploring lunar resource utilization by 2040s. Then they want to have a more permanent base on the moon. And what we see, referring back then to what others have been talking about, we see that the locations that China is contemplating setting up a lunar base are, in many instances, at least three instances, the same locations where the U.S. is contemplating setting up a lunar base. So it sets up the stage sort of for that competition that the others have been talking about.
Let me just change the direction just a little bit in the sense of what are we going for? Todd kind of touched on that a little bit earlier, because that could affect where we go and what we're looking for, and conversely, what our competition is doing. So, how important is it for us to answer that question? Are we there to get like ice crystals? Are we there to get helium-3? And who has that discussion so that we make that plan? And then how important is it for that to be conveyed to the public? Do we need them to be on board? That may not necessarily be the case in China, but for us, do we need the public to be on board and get it in order to drive whatever our main objective should be? And I don't know. I feel like I'm leaving Jerry out. I want to get his input on it too. So anybody can really chime in, but Jerry, if you have thoughts, please share.
Uh, you know, uh, the main issue that I see arising is the declining heft of the United Nations in upkeeping or bringing out any new and powerful treaty as the Outer Space Treaty. India has been a signatory to the Moon Treaty of 1979. It is one of the few, maybe one of the 18 countries who have signed the Moon Treaty. The US has not signed it, neither did the Soviet Union back then, nor did China. So there is a band of uh, second tier space programs. I see India there, including some of the major European countries, Japan. Uh, they have an approach where most of it is public-private led uh, lunar exploration, where the private sector contributes as contractors of technology development, but the whole mission, the since it's a risky investment, it is led by the governments. So that is a model which I see running a lot in the second tier, just below the US-China race. That is number one. Number two is if there is any new rule to be made, uh, I don't see any consensus getting built at the first tier. So if we go for eye for an eye approach between the Artemis Accords and the International Lunar Research Station project, the Sino-Russian project, then it is not going to lead to any consensus. So to build consensus on equitable exploration of the moon, equitable access to resources, and I believe more than that, there is still much more to discover on the moon. I mean, it's too early for us to, just go in for the resources. You still have to explore the lunar caves. There are large lava tubes to be explored. There is a group of the astronomy community. They want to set up a telescope on the far side of the moon to peer into, look into the deep space, into the deep universe. So there are various interest groups. Some are scientific, some are industrial, some are here as venture capitalist, and none of them are looking at the moon in unison. All of them are looking at it in silos. I mean, to end my answer, I must say that in the past 5 odd years, India has been really gung ho about the startup community, the space startup community, and some of them are really doing well. We've just had our first unicorn coming in a very short span of time. It's a space launch startup. But we believe that most of our startups may go and join the American cause. Whereas our lunar exploration will largely remain governmental, with people in national labs and universities and in other academic places contributing to it. So there are various communities who are stakeholders in lunar exploration, and there needs to be some kind of a platform where all of them chime in together.
Thank you. And I think that kind of dovetails into yet another point to bring up. Who should be the driver on this? Is it the government or can it be private enterprise? And obviously, we know what NASA has done in the past and what they're capable of, but we're also seeing things like, SpaceX, Elon Musk, and what he's been able to do too. So, who should be the main driver on this, and what are the benefits? If the government does it, they're great at this, but if private enterprise does it, they're better at this. Does anybody have thoughts on private versus government being the main driver on the next moon mission and where we go forward from here?
Well,
I can jump
I,
in there. I think that there's a big advantage that the United States has in using commercial companies to help provide the capabilities to get back to the moon. Commercial companies can iterate and innovate much faster than government. They can tap into much larger capital resources than the government is typically willing to provide. And so I think that's a smart way to run the program is to use commercial for launch, for building the lander. Obviously, there are risks with that because you don't have complete control. If you want to have assurance that you get there by a certain timeline, you're going to need more than one contractor. So there's some redundancy in that, but that also keeps competition going in the future and seeds more commercial opportunities down the road. But yeah, I think that there are smart ways to do that, and I think that's largely what we're doing. But the key is the government has actually got to fund, these initial, scientific and exploration missions to establish that there's a there, to establish how these things are going to work and how they can work, and to provide the enabling infrastructure so that other commercial operations can then come in. It's much like GPS enables lots of commercial applications in our economy, from Uber to the airline industry to logistics. It is the US government and the Space Force in particular that pays for that, that provides GPS as a free service, right? But there's so many economic multipliers that come off from that. We need to be thinking that way about what we're doing in the lunar exploration, is how can we build not only that scientific and technical knowledge and understanding, but lay the infrastructure that commercial industry can then come in and take advantage of.
You know, what's curious to me is if just kind of getting back to the premise of the main question, is there a space race and all the rest of that? If there is, it seems to me that there's two different finish lines here. From a kind of a sovereign perspective, a political perspective, the finish line is power, right? Is greater influence and power. And from a commercial perspective, it's simply more profit. I know I'm distilling it very simplistically, but there are two different perspectives about what you get out of it as a participant in that race. And again, to compare the US government versus the Chinese government is one thing, but I really think that the people who are going to be most, at least on the Western side, are most benefit out of this are the private investors and entrepreneurs and businesses who look to the moon and other areas of the solar system as potential profit centers, as opposed to just establishing more political power, geopolitical power, which I would attribute more to the Chinese perspective. I'm just wondering if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Well, and let me think of it this way. If we were to go down some of those paths that Jack and Todd mentioned, does it make sense then to have some sort of permanent base? Can some of this be done autonomously? To what extent do we need human presence there? What will that involve? Where are we in terms of, do we need a base at this point? Maybe down the line. Just any thoughts on what we need to do, kind of next steps, if you will, and where we're headed with this?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think we absolutely need a permanent base. It does not need to necessarily be permanently crewed. The crews could come and go periodically, but I think you're going to need that permanent base there, and you're going to need some, base infrastructure like a power source, a continuous power source, a large power source to actually, be able to do some of the exploration that needs to be done. But I think that inevitably you're going to have some humans there doing things just because of the remote nature of it, the uncertainty of what the environment is going to be like on a micro scale. And part of it too is the latency of communications from Earth. You're talking about speed of light, round trip is about 2.5 seconds between the Earth and the Moon. So that's a decent amount of latency to try to remotely control anything makes it difficult. So I think there are plenty of reasons for humans to be there. A lot of it, though, as especially once we learn more, and have some of the basic infrastructure there, a lot of it will likely be automated because it is a difficult environment for humans to live and operate in, for sure. But initially, we're going to need a permanent outpost on the lunar surface. And I mean, as a side issue, I don't know why we ever ended up with this architecture for a lunar gateway that's basically a semi-crewed space station orbiting the moon. The interest in the moon is not above it. The interest is on the surface. And so I am cautiously optimistic that, NASA will, complete its pivot away from the Lunar Gateway onto the lunar surface. And it's unfortunate that some of our European partners on the Artemis program had already started, bending metal and building hardware for this Lunar Gateway, but it just honestly didn't make sense, I think, from an exploration perspective.
Jack, you have some thoughts?
Oh, uh, well, I mean, the idea that Todd was talking about having people on the surface of the moon, I think is critical. It just struck me, it's very similar to here in the U.S. In the 19th century, there was this whole kind of homestead idea where if you occupied a piece of territory physically uh, for X amount of time and you developed it and so on and so forth, then you could acquire ownership for that. And I was thinking about that when Todd was talking about the need for human presence on the moon's surface. It's kind of analogous in that way.
Let's talk a little bit about the financing of it too, because in the end, I think there's got to be some payoff. And one of the slides that kind of struck me in Chris's presentation prior to all of us beginning our discussion was just how many trillions of dollars potentially could be gleaned from helium-3. We don't have it yet. I guess it hasn't been proven that we can do it, but if it starts trickling in and all of a sudden there's a significant financial driver on that, how does that impact things? And how do we get from we currently don't have that incentive to we do have incentive? Should I pick on Todd? Or how about Steven? Steven, you have any thoughts on the money part of it?
Yeah, I do have just a thought to kind of get this question going is I'm surprised that as robust as the Trump administration's response or initiative in space has been, it has not as explicitly as it might have tapped the resource issue. So Trump himself has made resources a central part of his administration's economic policy. So you have the critical minerals list, you have the whole thing about Greenland, you have the critical minerals deal over in Ukraine. You have we're going to use the oil of Venezuela. You have drill baby drill, but I haven't heard that much, at least from the government, about the use of space resources, other than to propel further space explorations. Separating oxygen, hydrogen for rocket fuel and helium-3 a little bit. But in 2020, the Trump administration issued an executive order basically decrying the Moon Treaty, denying that the moon was a global commons, and that it was both legal and encouraged to extract and utilize space resources for profit. But since then, I haven't heard that much from it. And I think if the American people are going to continue to fund and support it, the space mission philosophically, they need to have that profit motive in mind. You need to kind of go down to the level of the voter, the level of the taxpayer, and say there is something in it for you. And the notion generally of a space economy driven by the extraction and use of space resources might be the place to start.
And Kevin, how about you giving us some insight from the Chinese perspective, kind of along that line? Because I think they seem to be a little bit more focused than we are in terms of the resources. But when you look at, there's so many reports right here on Earth of how many of the natural resources they own the rights to or they're currently getting. Wouldn't that same philosophy then continue when it comes to the moon?
So looking forward, China has a top-down, more centralized approach. So they plan their economy, they plan their programs out in 15-year increments. So they're taking a long-term view of this. Um, uh, Absolutely, resource utilization is a key part of how they're looking at the moon. Also asteroid exploration and mining asteroids, space-based solar power. So there's sort of a big contingent within China's space community that is looking at how to um, manage, how to extract resources from space. So looking out into the future, as Todd had mentioned, yeah, it could be potentially be an issue if China is mining those resources and the US is not.
Looking at the
Yeah,
clock here, and go ahead, Todd.
I would just add one thought on that is, throughout human history, wherever commerce goes, wherever people suddenly find something of value, or even the perception that there's something of value, conflict inevitably follows, right? When there's a race for resources and countries, are competing against one another, you inevitably see conflicts. So that is something to be concerned about and the potential future, development of the lunar economy. And hopefully it will develop in a way where that, competition remains economic, remains commercial, and does not become, conflicts among governments.
Right. I'm going to read a quick comment that I'm seeing in the comment section from Chris, actually, about the Congressional Science Committee, which recommends topics and money for NASA. And for the first time, it did put in the mention of helium-3 in their 2027 budget. So that's kind of a good indicator of where they're thinking and what they're going to invest. But because we are kind of getting at time here, I want to just quickly go around everybody with kind of last thoughts. As you leave us here on this particular topic, we'll be looking forward to the next one. I'll mention that at the end here. But let's just go around in order. Todd, last thoughts on this flag or resource. If you could button it up and summarize.
Yeah, I mean, I think my summary would be that this is really a competition of will the deep space and the lunar economy in particular be run as a state capitalist system or as a free market capitalist system?
Mhm.
And that all depends on who really gets there first and starts proving value and, proving the ability to use lunar resources.
Yep. Yep. Jiri, your thoughts.
I think it's more about resources, but not exploration, not extraction, but prospecting them right now. So prospecting would take another few decades before we go in for really commercially viable extraction of resources.
Very good. Stephen.
I just want to echo something Jack said toward the beginning of our program that the United States is not engaged in merely a space race with China. The two other areas I would highlight are quantum computing and AI.
Yes.
And I think American people have really focused on those and are awake to it. They seem to be slumbering a little bit when it comes to the space race, but because the three are so tightly woven, I think it would behoove the government and institutions like this one to kind of get the message out about how they're related and why the space race is as important as the other two.
I agree, and we probably could have taken a bigger, much deeper dive on the quantum computing thing and the ramifications of that. But with that being said, I'm going to pass the baton now to Kevin.
Yeah, I would just like to say that China has a well-planned, well-financed space program. They know what they want to do, and they're proceeding to go ahead and do it. They want to be able to be equal to or surpass the United States in space technology. So this has some great implications for U.S. national power across the diplomatic, reputational, military, and economic arenas.
And Jack, your last thoughts as we begin to wrap it up here.
Okay, well, I think competition with China or with India or anybody is a good thing. It's the whole process that generates more technology, more opportunities, more learning about about where you want to go, what your priorities are, and it helps you to define your own strengths and where you have opportunities to develop new things. One of the things we've been talking about going to the moon for resources, I think the next step to think about over the horizon, of course, is a common topic, which is building infrastructure
Mhm.
to create a foundation for a lunar-based economy.
Do you think that we could, is it plausible or wise to partner with China as opposed to compete with China?
Uh, one of the Yes and no. One of the dangers of collaboration is that the collaborators tend to want to revert to some kind of mean. That is to say, that they want to build consensus. And by building consensus, you kind of cut out the tails of that distribution. And there's a lot of good stuff that gets tossed when you overly collaborate to get to consensus. So I have
Mhm.
mixed feelings about that.
Yeah. Well, I do want to thank all of you for being here today. I feel like we could go on for it. It's a huge topic. There's so much to go into, and we probably leaving some of it on the table. But hopefully, we've given some folks some insight, food for thought. And clearly, we have plenty more to discuss coming up in the future. In fact, the next session is going to be June 17th, and the topic of that one is ghost town or mining town. And I think that gets to the idea of if we establish a base, if we do go back there, is it going to be kind of like the gold rush? You run in, and then when there isn't any gold or you've depleted it, then it just goes away? Or is it we're going to establish something that's lasting? And I think, for example, Jerry talked about there's so much more to explore. So does it become a new colony as opposed to a boom and bust ghost town? But that's a discussion for another time. But in the meantime, I do appreciate all you guys joining us here today. And again, thanks to all of our audience. And I know this link will be available for folks to go back and rewatch it or share it later on. But thank you guys for joining in today.
It was a
Hey,
pleasure
Brett,
being with you.
if you have any more energy, there are a few audience questions if you guys wanted to take those.
Sure. Go ahead. Yeah. I'm looking to see where do I
Can't see
find
them.
the audience.
I could probably read them for you if you want me
Yeah,
to.
yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Food for thought. This is from me, by the way, for the audience. Location of the
Yeah.
landing on the moon could be very, very, very different from a resource versus science. So Artemis and China are appearing to go to the South Pole, but helium-3's concentration may not be the highest there. So the location of the landing might be come in question in the near future. First question comes from Benjamin. He said access to helium-3. Do you believe there's intentionally less publicity around this particular topic? Uh, is helium-3 been held back for a reason, or maybe it's just becoming mainstream now or discussed now? That's a question from Benjamin.
I'd say just, and I'm not an expert, but because of the broadcast part of it, knowing kind of what people are interested in, I think when I talk about it, and I happen to have heard about it first from a former executive at NASA, Dr. Douglas O'Hanley, who was a deputy in chief at NASA many years ago. But he brought up to me the idea of helium-3, and I listened and got an understanding. But when I talk to other people just now today, it's like they don't know what we're talking about. And I think if you're in the scientific community, if you're in space exploration, things like that, if you're there are places where people go, yes, I totally get it and it's useful. But from the public's perspective, I just don't think there's an awareness. And then you have to explain to the media, why is this a story that people would care about and how do we tell it? And I think from just a PR perspective, that would be some of my thoughts around that. But I think we have to try to change that discussion and get it out there more.
Kelly has a really thoughtful question. You guys answered it partially, but I think it's pretty interesting in perspective. She basically states collectively the International Space Station still seems to be operating cooperatively. We have Russia and some other partners up there. Could that same model be used for a lunar space base? If not, why not?
Mhm.
I can take that when the Russians are going to pull out of the ISS, and it'll be deorbited over the next few years, number one. And number two, I don't think, at least with regard to the U.S.-Chinese bilateral relationship, it's possible because of, number one, the Wolf Amendment, number two, because public opinion is just not prime for U.S. China space cooperation. And number three, as Jack pointed out, I think intense cooperation would result in deficiencies or, yeah, kind of an average to the mean.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'd also like to
Uh,
say we'd also have to consider the Chinese side in this and whether they'd be willing. And at a time where they want to demonstrate that they are a world power just like the United States, they may have their own interest in leading their own coalition to go to the moon that does not include the United States.
I think that kind of covers the bulk of the questions. There might be a thoughtful future topic. We've our company's kind of focused on helium-3. We think that's the main economic driver. But here's a question. If helium-3 drives the economics of the moon, now other resources that were not economically viable become economically viable. So if you're going to be up there building an infrastructure for potentially this, then you could potentially do research up there. Maybe you can pick whatever mineral you want because it's the same as on Earth. So, that could be another future topic is what are the other minerals, resources that could be extracted to be brought back for Earth or could be used on the lunar surface. I think that covers the main topics that were up here today, Brent.
Sounds good, Dan, and I appreciate you sharing those questions with us. And again, thanks to all of our panelists for your insight, your expertise, your time. It's been great for me, and I'm sure that our audience is enjoying it as well. And then don't forget that we're gonna be having another one of these coming up on June 17th. You see it on your screen there. Um, is it going to be a ghost town or a mining town? Another great topic to dive into, and we'll dive into that one next time. But thanks everybody for joining us for this one.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day or evening.
Yeah.